Is it just
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. That's my music for Charles C.W. Cooke, one of the great editors at National Review. He has his own podcast. I hear him often as well on the editors podcast of National Review. Charles, welcome. How was your week?
It was good, thank you. You're seeing me just as I'm about to get swallowed up by the Florida sun. So
Yes, well, it's a very good look. It's nice for the sunset to hit you. Charles, I got to ask you first. Are you a fan of Hamilton the musical?
Do you know I've never seen it? I've been trying to get around it. I know it's on. Is it Netflix? One of the streaming channels,
don't
but
do
I want
that.
to go see it in the theater. Yeah, exactly.
You
I
got
want
to
to see
see
it in the theater. I'm waiting.
Do you like Gilbert and Sullivan?
I do.
All right. Perfect. Because I heard you and Jim Garrity and Noah Rothman beat the living daylights out of Rich Lowry on tariffs. And I was thinking, no one's helping Rich. And if I'd been there, I would have said, this is all theater. It's Trump theater. It's Trump family theater. He's messaging. And the message is, don't come here, migrants who are about to give all your life savings to coyotes. And don't take fentanyl, kids. Am I completely nuts?
I don't think that you're nuts. I think Trump very often does this. The crazy man theory, I think, is true to an extent and worked pretty well in the first term. I'm just less persuaded that the tariff push has been well thought through. I mean, he just rescinded this afternoon, at least delayed the China tariffs as well, because the post office said it wasn't ready. I'm less persuaded that this one was Trump being diplomatic.
Well, let me ask you about your use of the term unfalsifiable. William Rehnquist used a line in the dissent to Texas v. Johnson. He quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, so I have to do this by memory. A page of history is worth a volume of logic. The history of migration and illegal entry into the country rises and falls with Trump and his messaging. I think the tariffs was all messaging, so I'm waiting for the history of what the metrics are, number of crossings. As a matter of economic, doesn't make any sense, but it makes a lot of sense to me in terms of messaging to people who would enter the country.
Sure. I mean, I think generally speaking, Trump is really good at this. He was inaugurated on January 20th, and within a few hours, the message had reached would-be illegal immigrants. The Biden administration was a disgrace on the border and made all sorts of policy changes. But one of the things that it did quite clearly that made the situation worse was send the message, come here. And Trump sends the opposite. So I think you and I would agree on most of it. I just think this tariff push was really haphazard and capricious.
Well, when you had the argument with Rich, you kept using the term unfalsifiable. And I've been teaching con law forever, and you can't prove a negative. I know that, but there will be metrics about which we can agree at the end of the first year. The first month doesn't much matter to me. It dropped 90% since Trump took office, but that doesn't mean anything. It's not long enough. Will it be unfalsifiable in a year that his messaging worked or didn't work?
No, I think that clearly you'll be able to tell whether Trump on the border has been a big improvement, whether the border is more secure, whether there are fewer people coming in. I have no issue connecting Trump's rhetoric and actions and policies to what I think will very obviously be an improvement on the southern border. My point was just that because he didn't lay out the desires, the aims, the ends, the goals with this tariff push, and it wasn't just Mexico, it was also with Canada and with China, all three have been delayed. It's quite easy just then to say, well, yeah, whatever happened in the interim is what I intended to do. But I'm not trying to suggest that there will be no improvement on the border. I think I've said very consistently for years that this is an executive issue. It's not that we don't have the laws. It's that the Biden administration didn't want to enforce them. Trump does.
See, I agree with you. I don't think you can ever prove to me that tariffs make economic sense. But Dr. Larry Arnn told me yesterday, president of Hillsdale College, he had this argument with Milton Friedman once. Milton Friedman hates tariffs. And Larry said to him, does that mean we let Russia build our submarines if they do a better job of it? And of course, Friedman said there are exceptions. Right. I think all of this is just theater about tariffs. Until I see it actually, I'm sorry to hear, I did not know they had pulled back China. That's bad because that's a national security tariff. Did you approve of the 10% on China?
Yeah, I think that as a general rule, the idea you just laid out is the perfect way of looking at it, which is that there are just some industries that you have to protect, whether it's economically efficient in some abstract sense or not. Obviously, when it comes to defense, I think there is an argument to do it with what was termed PPP during COVID. Anything that you could be really left out in the dirt if you don't do
Vulnerable.
it. So, yeah.
Stand by, Charles.
Right.
I'm going to go let the network take a break. We'll talk during the break. Charles C.W. Cooke will be back with me. I am back with Charles C.W. Cooke, one of the editors at National Review. He has his own podcast, Charles C.W. Cooke, and he contributes to the editors quite frequently. Charles, I want to get through in the time we have 4 more issues, in reverse order of their coming to my attention. I just read the Wall Street Journal story that President Trump's administration has paused $5 billion in electric vehicle charging station construction. What say you about that?
Oh, I think it's terrific. I think what you have seen the federal government do under Joe Biden is attempt to create an industry that would otherwise not have existed, at least on the scale that they wanted it, that does not enjoy great support from the public, and to do so out of hysteria over climate change. The charging stations are one small piece of this push. They said, oh, it's not a mandate. We're not trying to stop you buying gasoline car, but it's just not true. What they wanted to do was put so much infrastructure in place, put so many subsidies in place, change people's behavior so that the economics of car manufacturing was such that gasoline cars no longer made sense. So this is good. This is good both because the federal government shouldn't be doing what it was doing, but also because it's really, really unpopular in the country. About 7% of Americans have electric cars. This is great.
Do you have an electric car?
No, I do not.
Would you ever? I will never buy one simply because I don't know how to work them. Number one, they're more complicated than I am used to doing. Number two, there are concerns about reliability on my part. They call it range anxiety in the Wall Street Journal, which I think is a pseudo-scientific term. But would you ever buy one if they could prove something to you?
I like cars. I like gasoline cars. So I'm the wrong guy to ask about this, but the range anxiety thing is partly because the battery technology doesn't actually work properly yet. So we're way ahead of ourselves. I should say I do have a golf cart. I did build a golf cart here in Florida, but that's very different.
What, are you living in the villages?
No, no, I live on the beach though, but it's useful on the beach.
I'm kind of surprised by that. I love golf carts, but do you golf?
I don't golf, but I do take little local trips around on the golf cart because there's a bar down at the beach. You probably heard me talk about it on the editors.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I take the kids to baseball practice on the golf cart. These are just local trips, but I don't want a car that's like that.
No, and then you plug it in your garage at night. That's what golf carts are, but you would never take them on a highway or a street that's got real cars on it. Charles, since you have children, have you seen the new motorized bicycles that do between 25 and 40 miles per hour?
Yes.
Would you let your children have one of those before they were 16 or 18?
I would not. And one of my best friends here is a neurosurgeon, and he just hates those things because the number of cases he started to see with head injuries, especially when kids don't wear helmets on them, and they're essentially small motorcycles, is crazy.
And they go through parking lots where the speed limit's supposed to be 5 miles per hour, but they are kids and they do what kids do. That's the first time I've heard an anecdote about a neurosurgeon. I hope parents are listening. Coming right back with Charles C.W. Cooke to talk about Ukraine. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Charles C.W. Cooke is one of the fabulous writers over at National Review. Visit NRO online or get his podcast, Charles C.W. Cooke. You can find it wherever podcasts are available. And download The Editors, which I find always to be really robust, conservative conversation that doesn't always agree. Charles, last night, Ukraine began another advance on 2 fronts inside of Russia, proceeding 3 miles further, 5 kilometers further, with 2 mechanized battalions. What do you make of that they're able to punch through the Russian, North Korean defenses, and that Zelensky's pulling that rabbit out of his hat right now?
I wish them the best. As I have been from the beginning, consumed by a long-standing fear that this is going to be trench warfare that goes back and forth and ends up with a stalemate and in a battle of attrition. But this is good news. I mean, look, the Russians invaded that country. They shouldn't have done it. I think it is categorically wrong. I hope that the Ukrainians prevail. I hope that I'm wrong in my sense of how this will end. So I was pleased. It feels odd, doesn't it, talking about this? It feels like we've stopped talking about this in the last 6 months, but it's still going on.
What do you want to see happen?
Well, what I would like to see happen is for the Ukrainians to expel the Russians completely, take back all of the territory that they had prior to the beginning of the war, and for the world to watch Russia lose. I just unfortunately don't think that's going to happen.
What would you think is an acceptable resolution of the war? Because this war has gone, I talked about scale with a person offline today. The destruction of 10 Gazas, the death toll is extraordinary. Ukraine is approaching a lost generation on the order of Britain in World War I right now. It will be devastating.
Yeah, I just hate saying this because again, it sounds as if I'm equivocating between the two sides. I'm not. I think that to avoid probably more than a lost generation, Ukraine is going to probably have to give up some of its territory. But I think there is a certain point beyond which it's just not going to do that, and B, the public aren't going to stand for it. So I think that's what we're headed towards. But I would like to see them completely repudiate the Russians and kick them out from every last square inch.
The good must not be the enemy of the perfect. And I am haunted by the prospect of Ukraine being depopulated and, quote, winning. Are you a fan of Evelyn Waugh?
Sorry, of who?
Of Evelyn Waugh, the novelist?
Oh, Evelyn Waugh. Yes, absolutely.
Well, okay. So I happen to be reading Brideshead Revisited right now, or listening to it. Jeremy Irons should just read everything. And that book begins with the captain reminiscing about how Oxford was after the war. There isn't an Oxford in Ukraine, but there are a lot of villages that aren't there anymore. What do you think is the long-term effect, even if it stops tomorrow?
By the way, that's my favorite book of all time. And there's a great, the audiobook you're referring to is wonderfully read. There's also a fantastic British dramatization from 1981 in which Jeremy Irons plays Charles Ryder. So if you haven't seen that, you must.
I haven't. I've never actually read the book or listened to it. I've done Men at War, the Funeral Home book. I've done almost all Waugh, but I, for some reason, didn't have Brideshead Revisited. Now you say it's your favorite book ever.
That's right. My favorite book of all time. It's just absolutely beautifully written. But sorry, the question
is what would a Ukraine look like with a lost generation? There is no Oxford to depopulate and repopulate, and people to grumble about, but there is a country of significance that is being mortally wounded every day.
Yeah, and of course, unlike Britain, which reached the peak of its imperial power in the 1920s, just after World War One, it was really the Second World War that led to British decline. Ukraine was not in a hegemonic position to start with. So, I mean, this is the big problem, right? Is that you've got a Russian power that invaded Ukraine and that will win in some sense whatever happens. Even if Russia is kicked out to the last square inch, which isn't going to happen, then they have massively weakened their neighbor, and they see this as a zero-sum game. So, I mean, I just think it's going to be very bad for the region. And I don't think Russia is going to go over and invade Poland, don't get me wrong, but the buffer zone between Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe is now weakened. And this is why it's a disaster. And it's why I think some people on the right have been myopic in their attitude towards this.
Well, I think Senator Cotton pretty much articulates my position, which is send them weapons and give them intel and do everything, but don't give up the fight until there's at least a decent ceasefire. Charles, have you thought? I know you're a student of Russia. Have you thought about what happens after Putin in that country?
It's it's difficult, right? Because the Russians have always seemed to collapse into dictatorship or misery. I mean, it's a wonderful country in many ways. I just don't know if they have enough institutional history to move into the sort of mode that we would like. Without going on too long, I mean, by the time that the American Revolution happened, there were hundreds of years of institutions, both in Britain and the United States, or what it was then, the colonies, that they could ground themselves in. Russia went from the czars to the communist dictatorship, and then there was a brief period, which was when I visited, where it seemed like it could work out fine, and now they're back, perhaps not quite as bad, but pretty bad. And I just worry that they don't have enough habits to get out of that. So I hope they can go back to a Yeltsin style experiment and make it work this time. But I would not say I was optimistic, Hugh.
Neither am I. And Charles is right. The United States gets underway in 1603 or 7. I can't remember when Jamestown starts. And it's not until 1775 when the first shot is fired. When we come back with Charles, I'm going to talk to him about the gender executive order. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. That's Charles C.W. Cooke. Go and sign up for the podcast, National Review, the editors. Sign up for Charles C.W. Cooke's podcast as well. Perhaps he'll spend some time talking about law novels that we ought to read and in what order that we ought to read them, because people like me missed that when we were growing up. Stand by. I'll be right back. I'm back with Charles C.W. Cooke. I have two more segments with Charles. Charles, before I move to the gender executive order, since you are a very informed layman about the Constitution, and I like to hear you, because I've been teaching it for 27 years, so I'm burdened by the common law tradition where the Supreme Court interprets itself, which is not the way it ought to be done. Do you think the courts will get out of Trump's way? Because he's been stopped 4 times by district courts on 4 different things already. What do you think is going to happen there?
Wow, this is reminiscent of the first term, of course, in which you had injunctions from famously a judge in Hawaii putting a halt to, I think, presumptively constitutional behavior. And it's a difficult one because there are some questions that really do require national injunctions. If you're going to enjoin the law, you can't have various different interpretations in different places. But I am beginning to get flashbacks to last time, where the judiciary was overwilling to micromanage the administration based on what were not at all obvious likelihood of success. I mean, a good example of it is this offer that Elon Musk spearheaded with the buyout for federal employees, which got, I think, moved from Friday to Monday. I've been told over and over again that this audit that they're doing of USAID is illegal. I expect some judge will probably agree with that soon. No, I don't think that the courts are going to get out of their way. I do think that on a lot of questions, probably not the birthright citizenship one we talked about last time, but on a lot of questions, Trump is going to prevail. It will just take a while to work through the court system. And of course, that does slow you down.
Yeah, he built the trampoline in the first term. I think I've told you that before, when he put 3 justices on the Supreme Court. Now he's jumping on it. And how high he can go depends on what those 3 justices think of the original public meaning of the document and, of course, of the 14th Amendment. We will find out. Stand by. We'll come back and talk about the gender EO. And I appreciate your time. Don't go anywhere, America. Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt with Charles C.W. Cooke. One more question, Charles. The president had the signing ceremony for the gender executive order, surrounded by girls and women in sports. Some people saw the greatest photo op ever. Other people asked, where are all the black children? What did you see, and what do you think of what happened in the Oval Thursday?
Well, I'm not a bean counter. I don't like the division of Americans by race, and usually I don't like it in sex either, but this was, of course, appropriate given the topic. So what I saw was a common sense move that is supported by 80% of Americans, 67% of Democrats, the most recent poll showed.
Whoa.
And I saw the reversal of an abuse of the power that had been delegated to the executive by Congress. Now, this is not a topic that has slowly percolated and that over time the American public was won over on. There is no such thing as a groundswell in favor of men competing in women's sports. I don't usually hang out with people who work in politics as we do. And one of the things that has been most interesting to me in the last couple of years is the reaction from people who find out about men competing in women's sports for the first time. And then because they know that I write about politics, ask me about it. And it's just not like most issues, taxes or foreign policy or domestic issues. It is a horror and a surprise and a shock to them that this is happening at all. So I think this was probably the most popular thing Donald Trump is ever going to do. And I hope
You're right.
Congress moves.
You're right.
Yeah, I hope Congress moves to codify it, though, because the thing is, what we have learned about the Democratic Party in its modern incarnation is that it will advance these sorts of policies without public support.
I hope
So
they
I
hear
think
you.
this will be more hard to reverse than some others because of the sheer popularity of it. But I want Congress to codify this so that this is not on the table anymore.
That is well said. Charles C.W. Cooke, thank you. The sun is in your eyes. Go find some shades for next week or the next time, Charles. Thank you so much for your time today.